The snow had not yet arrived, but the lake had already taken on that eerie stillness that always came before winter, a hush so heavy it pressed into bone. Lake Tremblant was my sanctuary, the cabin I had poured 6 years of my life into, the place I rebuilt after losing everything in a divorce that nearly shattered me. I had invested not only the $600,000 it cost to acquire and restore, but also every ounce of strength I could gather when I had nothing left but stubbornness. Each cedar beam bore my fingerprints. Each reclaimed oak floorboard carried the weight of my tears and triumphs. Here, at last, I could breathe. Thanksgiving was supposed to be uneventful. I drove down to Ottawa for dinner with my parents, clutching the illusion that maybe, just maybe, family obligations would remain simple for one night. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon apples drifted through their home, pulling me into memories I wasn't sure I wanted. Crystal glasses sparkled in the candlelight, their prisms painting fractured rainbows across the polished table. Deceptive in their beauty. I should have noticed the looks. The two long silences, the way my father's gaze lingered on my brother Daniel and his wife before darting back to me. I should have recognized the choreography. Halfway through dessert, when the warmth of wine made everyone too comfortable, my mother cleared her throat, and with the precision of a dagger slipping between ribs, announced that Daniel's family would be moving into my lake retreat for a few months. Her words landed not as a request, but as a proclamation, already decided. Daniel smirked with that same entitlement he'd carried since childhood, as if my life and sacrifices were always his safety net. His children had apparently already chosen bedrooms. His wife had pinned ideas for redecorating. They had come prepared, emboldened by the unspoken backing of my parents. Shock struck first, then came the recognition, the familiar realization that I had once again been maneuvered into a corner, outnumbered and outvoiced. My parents spoke of family obligation and temporary necessity, words coated in honey but steeped in rot. For years, I had been the one who yielded, the one who surrendered time, money, and peace in the name of harmony. But harmony was always their code word for my silence. As their words cascaded over me, memories of other ambushes surfaced like ghosts the day they drained my college fund to cover Daniel's wedding, the car loan that was never repaid, the key to my apartment mysteriously duplicated, the $7,000 loan that somehow became forgotten. My entire adulthood had been a ledger of sacrifices written in invisible ink. And now they wanted the cabin, my sanctuary, the only place I had ever truly called mine. I held my breath, steadying myself against the rising tide of their entitlement. But beneath the shock was something unexpected clarity. For months, I had been preparing renovations on the cabin, filing permits, signing contracts, arranging with builders, not because I anticipated this ambush, but because I had finally decided to transform the cabin into the version I dreamed of. What they didn't know was that the cabin would be gutted down to the studs within weeks. I imagined their faces when they would see the permits, the locked gates, the construction crews. A quiet satisfaction grew inside me. For the first time, I was not unprepared. I was not defenseless. I was ready. The next week blurred into a storm of preparation. While they believed I was wavering under their pressure, I doubled down on my plans. I met with the foreman, walked through each room marking walls for demolition, signed off on deliveries of reclaimed lumber and triple-paned windows. I upgraded the security system, installing smart locks and cameras, ensuring that the cabin could withstand not just storms, but invasions of entitlement. At night, lying awake in my apartment in Montreal, I relived that dinner conversation in vivid detail, the casual cruelty of my father's tone when he dismissed my objection as being particular, the patronizing smile of my mother as she insisted this is what families do, the smug certainty of Daniel as though possession had already been transferred. Rage flared in my chest, but alongside it came resolve. They thought they knew me, the quiet daughter, the compliant sibling, but they had not seen what solitude on a frozen lake can carve into a woman's soul. They had not seen the strength born of nights repairing flood damage alone while they sipped cocktails in Aruba. They had not seen the grit required to rebuild trust in myself after betrayal. They had underestimated me, and in that underestimation lay my advantage. The Sunday before construction began, I returned to the cabin. Frost clung to the dock, crunching beneath my boots. The lake mirrored the gray sky, its surface brittle with ice crystals. Inside, the cabin was silent, yet the walls pulsed with the promise of change. I walked room by room, remembering the sweat that had gone into sanding floors, sealing leaks, hauling out rot. Each memory was a scar, and each scar deserved protection. I laid out the renovation plans across the dining table: new kitchen, expanded master suite, reinforced foundation, panoramic windows overlooking the lake. Every line on those blueprints was both a promise and a shield. They wanted my home as a stopgap for their poor planning. I wanted it to be a fortress of self-respect. The two desires could not coexist. That night, as wind howled across the water, I rehearsed the confrontation I knew was coming. They would resist, manipulate, guilt, threaten. They always did, but I had already made the choice: no more surrender. Thanksgiving had been the ambush. Christmas would be the siege. They arrived with boxes and movers, unannounced but expected, their arrogance as thick as the November clouds rolling over the mountains. The truck's engine rumbled up my gravel driveway, red logo gleaming like a warning. I stood at the edge of the porch, coffee in hand, watching the scene unfold as though it were a theater performance. Out stepped Daniel, striding across my property with the air of conquest. His wife trailed behind, directing movers, while their children bounced excitedly, shouting about their new rooms. My parents' car pulled up moments later, my father's stern face already set in the mask of negotiation. My mother's eyes rehearsed with tears. But instead of chaos inside the house, they were met with locked doors, security alarms, and orange cones marking the perimeter. The construction crew I had contracted stood waiting, foreman clipboard in hand. Demolition was scheduled to begin within the hour. For a long moment, silence draped over the driveway. Confusion flickered, then outrage. They realized, too late, that the house they had claimed was no longer accessible to them. It was no longer a vessel of obligation, but a fortress of boundaries. And as their fury erupted, as accusations and demands rained down like hail, I remained calm. The documents were already signed, the system already in place, the decision already sealed. Their invasion had failed before it began. I turned away from their chaos, stepping back into my cabin one last time before the renovation stripped it to bones. The walls seemed to exhale in relief. And in that moment, I understood this was not just about a house. This was about reclaiming every piece of myself they had tried to take. The war had begun, but for the first time, I was not afraid. I was ready. Snow finally came to Lake Tremblant in the first week of December, thick and relentless, muffling the world into silence. The cabin stood like a sentinel against the storm, its cedar walls dusted in white, smoke curling from the chimney as though exhaling secrets. Inside, the air smelled of pine logs and varnish, but beneath the warmth of the fire was a tension that had been building since the day my family arrived with their moving truck. They had left furious, thwarted by locks and contracts, but fury in my family never burned out quietly. It calcified into entitlement, sharpening into strategies designed to break me down. And I knew just as surely as the lake would freeze solid by January that they would not let go of this house without a fight. The first assault came in the form of calls and messages, my phone vibrating incessantly at all hours. My father's voice on voicemail measured, authoritative, honed from decades in boardrooms lecturing about family duty. My mother's texts, dripping with manufactured heartbreak, You'll make the children homeless for Christmas. Daniel's messages swung from rage to pleading to silence, the silence always the most dangerous. I muted them all. Silence, I decided, would be my answer. But silence only enraged them further. By mid-December, I began noticing unfamiliar tire tracks etched into the snow outside the cabin. Once, I returned from town to find footprints leading to the front porch, pressed into the snow with deliberate weight, the kind of footprints left by someone testing the locks. I tightened the security measures, installing motion-sensitive lights that flared across the yard like miniature suns, ensuring every trespass was exposed. Cameras blinked in the eaves, recording everything. At night, I lay awake listening to the wind whip against the cabin, my body tense, waiting for the next strike. Every creak of timber, every rattle of window panes made me wonder if they had come again. It was a siege not of armies and weapons, but of manipulation and psychological warfare. Then came the legal letters. My father had always wielded lawyers like scalpels, slicing through resistance with precision. He had sent one to my mailbox, an officious document asserting that temporary housing for immediate family was a reasonable expectation, citing vague notions of kinship obligations. But when I unfolded it beneath the amber lamplight of the cabin, I smiled. It had no teeth, no contract, no signature, no binding authority, my property, my name on the deed, my permits filed and approved. They could hurl paper at me all winter. The foundation of my defense was granite. But the true breaking point came just before Christmas. I woke before dawn to the low rumble of an engine outside, heart pounding. I pulled on boots and peered through frost-glazed glass. There, in the half-light, was a moving truck again, its headlights slicing through the snowstorm. My breath fogged the window as I watched figures emerge: Daniel, his wife, and two movers, dragging furniture across my snow-laden lawn. Rage ignited, but I did not rush outside. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed the security company, my voice steady as I reported unauthorized entry. Within minutes, the robotic voice of the smart lock announced unauthorized attempt, detected, authorities notified. Daniel's face twisted in fury as the locks refused him, the cabin impenetrable. The police arrived 20 minutes later, lights flashing blue against the snow, their presence scattering the intruders like startled crows. Daniel shouted about rights and obligations, his words slurred by cold and arrogance. But the officers stood firm. It was my property, my legal boundary. They escorted the movers away, leaving furniture abandoned in the snow. I stood on the porch, watching my brother's retreating figure, his breath steaming in the frigid air. He turned once, meeting my gaze with a look that blended hatred and disbelief, as if he still could not comprehend that I would choose myself over him. That look, sharp as ice, embedded itself in my memory. It was not the end. It was only the beginning. Christmas Day came, and with it, silence. For the first time in years, I spent the holiday alone, not in sadness, but in peace. I decorated the cabin with evergreen boughs, lit candles in the windows, and cooked a meal for one. Outside, the lake was frozen solid, the surface gleaming beneath a pale winter sun. I ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were sacrament. No interruptions, no demands, no ambushes. Yet I knew this was merely a reprieve. My family did not surrender. They regrouped. And sure enough, the next phase of their siege began before the year turned. In early January, social pressure arrived. My father enlisted neighbors, family friends, even our pastor, to call me. Each conversation wrapped in thinly veiled judgment. They spoke of unity, of compassion, of how families had obligations greater than property lines. I listened politely, thanked them for their concern, and returned to my blueprints. Every attempt to shame me only reinforced my resolve. But the true escalation came in the form of social media. Daniel's wife posted long laments about their homeless family, accompanied by staged photos of their children wrapped in blankets. The captions dripped with accusation while my sister-in-law enjoys her luxury cabin. We suffer without a roof. The posts gathered comments, sympathy from strangers, criticism directed at me. For 2 days, I burned with anger. I wanted to scream the truth into that void, to flood it with receipts and timelines and every piece of proof. But instead, I waited. I gathered. I documented. When the time came, I would not defend myself with words, but with undeniable evidence. The breaking of the siege began with a single phone call. The auction house director's voice crackled over the line as he confirmed receipt of the abandoned furniture left on my lawn. They had cataloged it, photographed it, prepared it for sale. The proceeds, as arranged, would be donated to the local foster youth program. His words settled over me like warm wool. The pieces my family tried to plant in my sanctuary had been transformed into tools of generosity. Their attempted invasion had birthed my retribution. I imagined Daniel's face when he discovered the heirloom dresser, the dining set, the armchairs all gone, all sold, all repurposed for children who had never known stability. Satisfaction pulsed through me, sharp and sweet. This was not just defense. This was counterattack. By February, the renovation was in full swing. Walls came down, beams exposed, floors torn apart. The cabin was no longer a target for invasion, but a battlefield I had already claimed. Construction crews moved like an army under my command, their saws and hammers echoing through the winter air. Each strike of the hammer was another declaration: this is mine, and it will remain mine. And still, my family circled. They sent letters, left voicemails, even drove by at night, their car headlights sweeping across the property like searchlights. But I remained unshaken. They had underestimated me, and now they were losing ground with every passing week. The final blow of Part 2 came in March. When the auction results were published in the local paper, the headline read, "Heirloom Furniture Funds Foster Youth Program." The article praised the anonymous donor whose generosity had furnished a shelter with matching sets for the first time in its history. Photographs showed children smiling, reading books at tables my family once claimed, sitting in chairs they once demanded. The town applauded, my family fumed, and I, standing amid the gutted skeleton of my cabin, smiled. The siege had turned. March in Quebec is deceptive. The snow still lingers, crusted gray along the shoulders of the roads, but the sun has begun its slow return, flooding the lake with an illusion of warmth. Lake Tremblant reflected the sky like a broken mirror, half ice, half water caught between two seasons. I felt the same way, caught between what my family thought I still was and what I had become. By now, my cabin no longer resembled a home. It was a skeleton, stripped to beams and subfloors, filled with the constant roar of saws and the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Construction dust coated everything. The scent of fresh-cut wood clung to my hair and clothes. Yet to me it was beautiful. Every demolished wall was a boundary reclaimed, every exposed stud a declaration of autonomy. When the newspaper article about the furniture auction came out, I expected silence from my family. What I received instead was an explosion. Daniel called 30 times in a single afternoon. My mother left a voicemail so shrill it distorted, "You have humiliated us publicly." My father's letter arrived days later, crisp and formal, threatening to disinherit me entirely if I did not rectify the situation. I read it while standing in what used to be the living room, beams open to the sunlight, and laughed. They had already cut me out emotionally decades ago. A will on paper was just punctuation to a sentence long finished. But they were not done. They never were. The next siege was psychological. They began showing up uninvited, standing just beyond the construction zone as though waiting for me to crumble. My mother's tears, visible even through the windshield of her car. My father's silent, seething stare. Daniel pacing like a caged animal, his children in the back seat, confused and restless. They wanted me to see them, to feel guilt gnaw at me like frostbite. But guilt had lost its power. I had built new armor receipts, permits, auction slips, security footage, facts, evidence, truth, and the truth was a stronger shield than their manipulation ever could be. When Daniel finally tried to force his way onto the property one icy morning, shouting that he had a right to enter, the security guard I'd hired stepped forward calmly, hand resting lightly on his belt. Daniel stopped, his bravado collapsing in the face of real consequence. That moment crystallized everything for the first time in our lives. The consequences were his to carry, not mine. Yet even as their schemes failed, they escalated. In April, rumors began spreading through town. Whispers that I was selfish, that I had betrayed family, that I had stolen heirlooms meant for generations. At first it stung, hearing acquaintances look at me with veiled suspicion. But soon the tide turned, because truth, once unleashed, travels faster than lies. I released documentation carefully, never in anger, always measured, copies of the donation receipts, photographs of the children at the foster shelter seated at my family's abandoned table, smiling wider than Daniel's kids ever did, screenshots of permits dated months before their supposed crisis. Slowly, the whispers shifted. I was no longer the villain of their narrative. I was the woman who had stood her ground. And then came the moment of absolute reversal. One evening in May, I received an invitation to speak at the local community center. The director wanted me to share how the donation had impacted the foster program. I arrived in jeans still dusted with sawdust, unsure what to expect. What I found was a room full of children and volunteers, applauding me as though I had saved them personally. They showed me the reading nook furnished with my grandmother's dresser, the dining hall lined with chairs Daniel's wife once insisted were too valuable for strangers. They told me the children felt, for the first time, like their space looked like a real home. My chest ached with something unfamiliar pride untainted by obligation. The local newspaper covered the event. A photograph ran the next day me, surrounded by children holding books, smiling beneath the headline, "From Family Feud to Community Gift." My father must have seen it. My mother too. Daniel certainly did. For days afterward, the calls went silent. Perhaps even they realized the ground had shifted beneath them. But silence was not surrender. June arrived with thunderstorms, violent ones that rattled the cabin's half-built walls. On one such night, lightning struck a pine at the edge of my property, splitting it in two. The next morning, I found evidence of intrusion again, muddy footprints near the shed, tire tracks cutting through the wet earth, tools missing, scattered lumber overturned. They had tried to sabotage the renovation. I called the police, filed reports, tightened security further. Cameras captured blurry figures retreating into the night, their outlines unmistakable. My brother's rage had tipped into recklessness, and recklessness always left trails. That was when I decided defense was not enough. It was time to escalate. I began quietly gathering every piece of evidence. The duplicated key Daniel once stole from me, photographed, old bank transfers documenting unpaid loans, the text messages proving he had known about his foundation issues months earlier, even the voicemail from my father, threatening disinheritance if I did not comply. I organized it all into a meticulous dossier, a portfolio of every trespass, every theft, every manipulation. And then, I prepared my counterstrike. At the end of June, with the cabin halfway restored and the lake shimmering under summer sun, I invited my parents to visit. Not Daniel, not his wife, just them. They arrived cautiously, expecting confrontation. What they found instead was undeniable proof. I laid the dossier on the stripped dining table, the same surface where I once ate Sunday dinners under their watchful eyes, page by page. I walked them through years of history, the stolen savings, the unpaid debts, the intrusion into my home, the attempted takeover of my cabin. Their silence grew heavier with each page. My mother's face paled, my father's jaw clenched, but neither could deny the weight of truth. Then I showed them the photographs of the foster children at the community center, their heirlooms once symbols of entitlement transformed into symbols of generosity. My father's eyes flickered, the negotiator in him recognizing the checkmate. My mother's tears came, but they were quieter this time, stripped of performance. I ended with a simple statement. Steady as bedrock boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are survival. They left that day diminished, not defeated but weakened in ways I had never seen. My father, usually a storm of authority, walked slower, shoulders bent. My mother, usually dramatic in despair, said only, "We will talk later." It was the first time in my life I felt like the adult in the room. But the true reckoning was yet to come, because Daniel was still out there, furious, humiliated, plotting. And I knew just as the sun rose over the glimmering lake each morning that he would try again. He always did. And when he did, I would be ready, not just to defend but to deliver the final strike. July arrived hot and relentless, the kind of Canadian summer that feels like retribution after months of snow. Lake Tremblant shimmered under the sun, its surface alive with ripples of light, a mirror too bright to look at directly. My cabin, halfway rebuilt, rose steadily from its skeleton, each beam a testament to survival, each window frame opening toward freedom. But beneath the hum of saws and drills, I knew the real construction was happening inside me. I had been forged by months of siege. The ambush at Thanksgiving, the moving trucks, the threats, the sabotage, every attempt to break me had instead hardened my resolve. But I also knew one truth: Daniel would not stop until he was forced to. And so, I prepared for the endgame. The first sign came on a humid Thursday. The security cameras pinged my phone at dawn. Daniel's SUV creeping up the gravel road, headlights off, moving like a predator. I watched from the balcony, coffee in hand, as he and his wife stepped out. No movers this time, no parents. Just them, carrying crowbars and determination. They thought the early hour and half-built walls would make me vulnerable, but the cameras had already alerted both me and the local police. I stayed calm, steady, watching them fumble at the locks, listening as the robotic voice of the security system announced unauthorized entry detected. By the time police cruisers arrived, sirens slicing the morning air, Daniel was inside the garage, trying to pry open the door. His wife stood on the lawn, shouting about family rights. The officers moved with practiced precision, restraining Daniel before he could protest. His rage boiled over, his voice cracking in the summer heat as he screamed about betrayal, about inheritance, about how the house should have been his. And as they placed him in handcuffs, I stood at the top of the porch stairs, calm as stone, watching the spectacle unfold. It was not triumph I felt, but something quieter, deeper justice. The charges were not catastrophic trespassing, attempted break-in, violation of warnings, but the humiliation was. His mugshot appeared in the local paper the next day, beneath a headline that made my coffee taste sweeter: "Local man arrested in lake cabin dispute." The narrative flipped overnight. Those who once whispered that I was cruel now shook their heads at Daniel's recklessness. The pastor who had once called me urging compassion sent a letter apologizing for misjudging me. The community, weary of his entitlement, rallied quietly behind me. For my parents, it was the final fracture. My father could no longer shield Daniel with words or money. My mother could no longer weep her way into sympathy. The evidence was too strong, the shame too public. Their silence grew heavy, stretching across weeks, a silence not of strategy, but of defeat. Meanwhile, the cabin transformed. By late August, the walls were up again, insulated and painted. The kitchen gleamed with reclaimed wood counters. The master suite opened toward the lake with floor-to-ceiling glass. The dining room, once the stage of ambush, became a space of light and air, a place I could breathe freely at last. I hosted friends there for the first time, real friends, not relatives who took without giving. We drank wine under the vaulted ceiling, laughter echoing against fresh plaster, joy untainted by obligation. For the first time in years, I felt what family was supposed to mean: chosen, cherished, reciprocal. But my true satisfaction came in September, when the community center invited me to their annual gala. They unveiled a plaque honoring major donors. My name, etched in bronze, gleamed above the words, "For transforming loss into hope." Photographs of foster children surrounded the stage, their smiles brighter than any chandelier. And in the audience, I spotted my parents. They had come quietly, sitting in the back, their faces drawn, their postures hesitant. They watched as applause filled the hall, watched as strangers embraced me, watched as I accepted the plaque. For once, their eyes held not judgment, but something softer: recognition. The final confrontation came weeks later, unplanned. I was walking along the dock at sunset, the lake painted in gold and crimson. When Daniel appeared at the edge of the property, he looked smaller, diminished, his arrogance stripped away by months of consequence. His voice, when he spoke, was low and unsteady. I did not interrupt. I did not offer comfort. I let him speak of debts mounting, of reputation shattered, of realizing too late that entitlement builds nothing. He admitted what I never thought he would: that he had counted on me, always folding, always yielding, always carrying the weight for him. I listened, silent as the lake, and when he finished, I gave him nothing more than truth: that the cabin was mine, the boundaries were mine, and the life I had rebuilt was not his to take. I turned away, leaving him at the shoreline, a man staring into waters that would never again reflect him as the favored son. October brought completion. The cabin stood renewed, stronger than before, each corner imbued with memory and defiance. On the day of the housewarming, friends gathered, music spilled from open windows, and lights shimmered across the lake. The air was crisp with autumn, the trees ablaze in red and gold, as though the entire forest celebrated with me. I thought of the girl I once was: the compliant daughter, the silent sister, the woman who slept with locks checked 3 times because safety was never certain. And I thought of the woman I had become: the builder, the strategist, the survivor who turned siege into sanctuary. The housewarming ended late, laughter echoing into the night. As the last guest left, I stood alone on the porch, gazing at the darkened lake. My phone buzzed with a single message from my father. "Respecting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's adulthood." The same words I had once thrown back at him, seeing them now, written by his own hand, felt like the final renovation, not of walls or windows, but of history itself. That night, as I walked through my cabin, touching each beam, each polished surface, I realized the war was over. I had won not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed. My revenge was not in their humiliation, though that had been sweet. My revenge was in living, in thriving, in creating something unshakable from the ruins they left me. The cabin was no longer just a house. It was proof, proof that boundaries hold, that survival blooms into strength, that justice sometimes looks like reclaimed oak and glass catching morning light. And as dawn broke across Lake Tremblant, painting the water in silver and fire, I whispered the truth I had earned through blood, dust, and silence. Peace does not come from surrender. Peace comes from the courage to stand,